Whenever we consider our country joining anything or doing any national initiative, there are two basic things we have to get out of the way, first and foremost. Two basic things. Without those things, we have no legitimacy. The first one is the Bahamas Constitution, and the second one is the map. The Constitution and the map. Every day, every member of Parliament, every member of the Cabinet, every civil servant should be asking themselves, is this consistent with the Constitution, and is it coherent with the map? And if you do those two things, you'll be guided strategically in the proper direction almost every single time. And certainly, you will have legal validity and economic substance. Legal validity on the basis of the Constitution, economic substance on the basis of the map. The map tells you where you need to go. I always say this because when I advise governments, invariably someone runs in with a copy of a manifesto and sits down and hugs it very close as if it were Holy Writ and say, now this is where we want to go. And my thing is, please take that away. Bring me the map. The map will tell me what you ought to be doing that you're not doing, and what you can do in the future. So take this little sort of scenario as an inclusion of these two things. When a government decides on a strategy that can alter the prospects of the value of citizenship for its citizens, that can denude the landscape of their presence and their culture, like the WTO, it doesn't do well to approach this by promoting the WTO to its citizens, particularly when those citizens have experienced substantive marginalization from the benefits of prosperity that the country has already produced. Instead, a government works with citizens to formulate a core strategy aimed at protecting the government's capacity to facilitate the promises of its political manifesto. That manifesto directed from the people. Why? Because the democratic process requires that our governments are elected for the purposes of bringing into being the benefits of the promises made to the electorate. Let's put it more plainly. The Bahamas belongs to its citizens. The citizens elect a government under the Constitution, and it is the duty of that government, the Bahamas government in this case, to ensure that the citizens, the Bahamians, benefit from its actions, its every action, from the country's structure, resources, and operations. The government has no power to act on its own volition, has no power to engage in exploratory and experimental exercises divorced from the ambitions of its people, unless it is acting in a manner demonstrably for the peace, order, and good governance of the Bahamas.
My Lord.
Article 52.
My Lord, my Lord, my Lord.
The government in our constitutional democracy are not decision makers, as is commonly thought. They represent and are bound legally to represent the wishes of their citizens, whatever members of the government may feel. That is, unless the citizens insist on some matter of conscience, which is an outrage to human value. There, the government has the right and the duty to instruct and to guide its citizens in the path that is right, which will normally be consistent with the Constitution itself. Therefore, when considering organizations like the WTO, it is the duty of the Bahamas government to seek and know and understand what its citizens want, not to define the WTO to them, not to promote the WTO to them, not to appeal to them by telling them that everyone else has joined. If the people of the Bahamas have another vision for themselves and refuse to join an organization out of a defiant sense of themselves, that they have another idea of their future possibilities, it is the government's duty to lay before them all other alternatives, presented equally without prejudice, to allow the people of the Bahamas to decide. Suppose the government in its wisdom says, we are trying an initiative which will fulfill our duty to our citizens. Let us say that the initiative is making the Bahamas the solar panel manufacturing center of the Americas. Imagine that. If I were Prime Minister, it will never happen, but if I were Prime Minister under such a scenario, I would show that the Caribbean, Florida, and the southern United States are going to see a 10,000% increase in solar panel demand over the next 30 years. That this industry in the Bahamas, perhaps jointly with Chinese partners, manufacturing partners, would produce the cheapest solar panels anywhere in the world. Competitive advantage.
Wow.
I would say Bahamians are rightly concerned about sand exports, so instead of stopping or shopping for experts or taking it over directly, we are going to use a portion of our sand for high-grade industry-scale manufacturing of solar panels. I would tell my citizens we're going to corner the market because it will not only be the cheapest and the highest grade, but the industry will reduce the cost of power to Bahamians as well, so there's a benefit for them beyond their investment, and it will be owned by Bahamians. It is not enough that this solar panel initiative produces some economic benefit. It must be transformative. I would show my people my plan to finance them, provide technical education, demonstrating to them how the solar initiative would both benefit them and lead to their prosperity and transform their economy. It is only then that I would say, in order to deliver this, the US and the South American nations will not allow us to export our solar panels to them unless we are WTO members. And in this argument, you would have a basis, a rationale to say, maybe we should join the WTO.
Yeah.
So that's the scenario. The scenario is to say, if you're going to join the WTO, if you come to your country in a democracy to say, let's join the WTO, the idea is not to promote the WTO, tell people how good trade is, why you have to be involved in trade, and all those sort of first chapter ideas about trade and neoliberalism in the world. What we should be doing is coming up with a strategy that has nothing to do with the WTO, everything to do with our prosperity. And in the transmission of that strategy, saying to our people, hey, we want to corner the market on solar panels. We are in the right region. The southern United States is the right market. You have over 17 million people are going to move into the largest southern area of the United States over the next 35 years. We will need that. The benefit to us is not just some investment, but it is training, education, and we are going to be owners, equity holders. And when you present an argument that way, and then you say, finally, but to do this, there are some things that are required of us. Then we are speaking in the right way about the trade. So let me go a little ways now to talk about some aspects of the WTO itself and the GATT. The GATT was formed. This is a long history in some senses. You could begin, there are a number of places you could begin. You could begin at the end of the First World War and the fear that Germany would rise and the attempt to establish trade organizations to actually deplete Germany of resources. So that was the first iteration. That didn't work out so well, and under the Treaty of Versailles, and then flowing into the 1930s, Germany recoiled, and this led to, in many respects, amongst other things, to the Second World War and a conflagration. The United States again attempted to discipline Germany, but switched in the middle of its policy to the Marshall Plan. And it wanted a system where trade was based not on results, but rules. It's based on results, not on results, but rules. And it'll be interesting to note that the first set of meetings, the Geneva Round, one of the eight rounds of trade with the Geneva Round, is actually rightly called the Cuba-Geneva Round, but Cuba is never really mentioned. But Cuba was one of the first, in fact, to be, the first set of meetings were held between Cuba and Geneva in 1947. And it is interesting also to note that Cuba has been part of this organization from its inception, yet Cuba is the one country that has not benefited the least bit from it.
That's right.
And it is an interesting thing to say that the WTO is a rules-based organization with a dispute resolution mechanism, yet one country, because of one other country, remains under an embargo for half a century. Whatever one thinks of Cuba, and there are certainly countries misbehaving, who are friends of the United States, behaving very, very badly, and do not have the same profile under the organization as Cuba. I may compromise my Miami rights right there, but there we are. One of the interesting, so you had the Geneva Round, the Cuba-Geneva Round, you had the ANSI Round, you had the Torquay Round, you had the Dillon Round, another Geneva Round, Tokyo Round, Uruguay Round, and now the Doha Round. And so these rounds are basically time frames for negotiation to come to a universal deal with all members of the trading bloc. What we have in this this trading bloc, so you have the gap before that was a general agreement on trade tariffs, and what was significant is I think the gap was essentially very successful, because the idea behind the gap was you make something over here, you want to sell it over there, and we want to create rules to allow those things to move across borders. So that was the general idea. And to a large extent, that was very successful. So the GATT managed to reduce global tariff rates significantly from above 30% to well below 10% over its time until 1986. It was based on non-discrimination and flexibility, notion of flexibility, and the idea of general consensus. But there was another characteristic to the GATT which is very important. It had these rules called special and differential rules. So it means that it was something called the Quad, right? So the Quad is the United States, the European Union, Japan, and Canada. And they basically followed the rules for themselves because they control 80% of global trade. And they allowed the smaller nations to have this special and differential thing, and we don't really need you anyway, so we're trying to get access to each other's markets and so on, so we don't really need you. Things changed after 1986, and it changed in very significant ways. And one of the things I want to show tonight is how that change has come full circle. And if you're going to make the case that there is some vision or some strategy that one has for the Bahamas being a member of the WTO, when you come around that circle again, the case is even harder to make if you understand what has happened since 1947, right? So let's go into that a little bit. Now, the benefits of the WTO are said to be peace, increased trade, dispute settlement, greater prosperity, equality of nations. Let's take peace. Has anybody seen the news from Paris recently? Right? You see what's happening in Paris. Anyone know what's happening in the UK? We seem to have a little local difficulty. Spain's debt is 301% of GDP. Italy's private debt is 298% of GDP.
Wow.
The EU has created a euro with one central bank, but no monetarism. So you've got multiple treasuries, one central bank, multiple treasuries making monetarist decisions which go against the euro. You already have banks around the world transferring their euros to German banks. What does that mean? That means that euro is a Deutschmark. 50% of all German trade, or German GDP, is trade to the European Union. What does that mean? It means it's crowding out entrepreneurship in all the other European countries and making it difficult for those countries to survive. These points can be found anywhere in all the literature. It's not me. It's not me. In all the literature. And I've gone further in saying that the EU is dead and the euro is even deader. But that's me. So that's not the UN, that's not the Bank for International Settlements, that's not Richard Baldwin or any of the scholars and so on. That's me talking. And the reason for that is that you have a situation where there's been no distinction between harmonization and liberalization. You have a situation where an institution that was founded essentially to control Germany has expanded into a quasi-governmental institution across Europe without the governmental levers, that issues a currency that it can't control, that sets out a set of rules for deficit spending at 3%, which no country obeys. And so this creates a real problem. But the real issue is the feelings of the populations. So the Greek population may have a certain feeling about this. Why? Because they've been asked to borrow billions of dollars not to invest in Greek infrastructure, not to invest in developing Greece, not to get Greece out of its financial problems, but to pay German banks. Now, why is that? How's that happening? How's that happening? That is a top-down management proposition that the people of Greece cannot resist. That's what that is. A top-down management proposition, power play, that the people of Greece cannot resist. And why did this happen? Well, in the European Union, people inherited, they owned their houses. They didn't have mortgages. This civilization is 1,000 years old. And the German banks looked up at one point and said, oh my goodness, all these new members of the EU and these people own their houses. What don't they have? BMWs, Mercedes-Benz, these sorts of things. They loaned them this money. Of course, the Greeks have to take responsibility. They took the money. All right. And now, the objective is you've got to get this money out of Greece, because when Spain and Italy come calling, there will be no answer. There's no bailout mechanism. You've got to get this money. So this is an example in I'd say microcosm, but regulated to Europe, of how the international system ossifies and all the promises which are made. Remember the EU's two promises after the Second World War. You should have prosperity and you should have security. You have neither. These are the promises which are made. Now, does that mean that we have to think that there's some sort of scheme or some Illuminati objective which has kept this so? No. We are human beings. They are human beings. They organized a bad system, and it's having predictable effects. When we are considering whether to join any sort of organization, we're not saying that joining the WTO will result in that. Although the facts around the world, and 3,000 pieces of literature, I'm talking about academic literature over the last 15 years, even those who are fanatically for WTO say developing countries have had a bad go of it in the WTO. Go through the literature, everywhere you go. developing countries, Cato Institute said it, American Enterprise Institute, right-wing organizations say it, Hoover Institute papers say it, Judge Institute at Cambridge University say the same thing. Their papers come to the same conclusion. And they ask for hopefulness. Let us be hopeful that things will change in the future and so on. But I imagine the Greeks know something about the look of that hope at the moment. And so I'm saying that so that peace question is a question. In France, the issue is that people feel that the benefits, they're watching Bernard Arnault, who owns Louis Vuitton Moet Hennessy, making billions and billions and billions. The ordinary French, their wages haven't moved. France hasn't grown above 1.2% for 20 years almost. And so this is a difficulty. People feel that there's a great deal of anxiety. You have I call it the warmongering Ponzi. So governments tax their citizens and then transfer that money to defense contractors. And those of you who think, when you hear defense spending and you think, so they're giving money to the military. It's not the military that's getting the money. It's the big, organizations like Raytheon and, GE and these groups, they're getting the money. And then politicians leave their positions and then go work for these companies. And then there's the pursuit of wars, and these wars create refugees and so on. These refugees spread out all over the place and create a mix, and then you end up with the situation on the streets of Paris. That's the cycle. That's what's happening. Right? Those are facts. It's not you can read that in any analysis, Le Monde, Der Spiegel, any one of the great newspapers and so on. That's what's happening. So, again, big promises at the top level, people in gray suits, in black suits, shaking each other's hands and so on, and saying how wonderful their deals are and what they've done, and it turns out that it creates an unholy mess in the lives of human beings. This is what's happening. The other day in Oslo, I think it is, the police chief gave a press conference saying that we have lost control of Oslo. It's been taken over by immigrants, and they're, basically it's warmongering on the streets of Oslo. All right. Yes, that's true, and those people who are responsible, but there's a larger context to this. The West has made terrible mistakes. You've seen the situation in Venezuela. I'm not going to go on and on about it. And I've heard people say over and over again, well, Maduro is the problem. Maduro is a problem. The real problem are the oligarchs who have held that country in a stranglehold for 100 years.
Well, you better preach.
Supported by Western governments that produced Chavez as a reaction
My God.
All right? And that has produced Maduro.
Yes.
Does that make Chavez or Maduro right? No. Does it mean that they can become our best friends and we should go out and support them? No. But we have to now be able to engage in analysis that identifies the problem as it is. As it is. And that is the problem. So the people of Venezuela face a formidable choice whether to stay with Maduro or to allow the largesse of the Western countries to come in and be returned, as it were, to the servitude of their long-standing oligarchs.
My God.
This is the architecture of the world that has to change.
Every system.
So, we could talk about the United States. And you hear people all the time talking about the Trump voters this and the Trump voters that and so on. So let us understand this. You have a banking system in which people are allowed to lever 40-1. Right? Alan Greenspan, I was, Sebastian Mallaby of the Council on Foreign Relations was commissioned to write a book on Alan Greenspan, which he did write, and I was commissioned to do a review of the book. And in that book, after 2009, Greenspan's testifying before Congress. He's shrunken. He's not the great maestro anymore because his thesis has blown up in his face in 2008. And he said something very interesting. He says, this is Alan Greenspan now. This is Alan Greenspan now. Capitalism is broken. Broken. He doesn't say it doesn't meet the needs of ordinary people. He says something a little bit more subtle, a little bit more interesting. He says, I thought that capitalists, people operating within the market, would self-regulate to avoid catastrophe.
My God.
But they have no self-regulating mechanism.
Greed, man.
No self-regulating mechanism. Now, think of that and hold that thought. And I know I'm asking you to hold several thoughts, but hold that thought as well in terms of what we are inviting upon ourselves. And whether or not the concept of capitalism that Greenspan himself condemned is exactly what we are enticing to take dominion on our shores. So, the idea is that, another idea is increased trade. Increased trade is one of the benefits. Now, I have to say that that's true. That's true. There's been increased trade. But it's a very interesting sort of thing, right? Very interesting sort of thing. When you are in an African country and you have resources, but no cash, when you're paying reparations still to France, as the scandal is borne out, Sarkozy and Mitterrand and Edouard Balladur and the rest of them involved in this process. I'm talking about today, paying money to French governments today. And you are said, you go to an international meeting, you are told, we have these French companies, these German, we want you to open up your country to them. You open up your country, they take control of your resources. You are threatened by other Bretton Woods organizations to comply and be complicit in your undermining, your denuding. You're asked to be complicit in that. And then when the trade is registered from your country, that is registered as trade. That is registered as increased trade. So again, no one here is saying, don't join the WTO. We're not saying that. We are rationalists. We're saying, we're painting a picture of what we have been presented with, and we're asking you to answer for it. If you're going to promote it, you must answer for it. Because you cannot, in a constitutional democracy, merely suggest, right, that we eviscerate the value of Bahamian citizenship and the government's constitutional power to make decisions for the peace, order, and good governance of the Bahamas, and to do so on a promotional whim without any analytical substance. That seems foolhardy. That seems foolhardy. All right, so the increased trade proposition really is a substitution, a hand-eye coordinating illusion in many respects. And if we were going to join, we should be saying, well, you know that section there on how you register trade? We, the Bahamas, would require you to analyze that in a different way to demonstrate to us that that has value for our people. That's how you walk into a situation where you're defending your own birthright. And that's the way it has to be done. So, you've heard this notion of the dispute settlement. Now, this is the holy grail. This is saved for the last. This is when people say, okay, now I know there's one thing because you get trade, and now you have a dispute settlement mechanism, which is very important. In 1982, Canada became concerned about the damage to its environment, and it tried to institute a Investment Review Act. Investment Review Act. The United States immediately, and a number of other countries, blocked them from this and argued this was a trade barrier. Should not be allowed. Should not be allowed. All right? When the United States and Canada again, in the 1960s tried to initiate a auto pact where they had free trade in autos between the two countries. And when countries brought this matter, WTO members brought this matter before the dispute resolution, GATT members brought this before the dispute resolution mechanism, the United States blocked the panel, unilaterally. Blocked the panel. So I'm saying, you know, I'm from Abaco and 8 Mile Rock and things like that, so, you know, no diggity and all that sort of thing. So basically, if I'm going to join something, I have to have some control over it. And then I can't really join and know that someone over there, when it is in their interest, will basically tell me what to do in front of my wife and children. You know, I mean, as if I'm a schoolboy. So we can't have that. And there's a disequilibrium in these organizations between big and small. There isn't a level playing field. There isn't a level playing field. And one of the things I say all the time, when you talk about economics, people talk about, let's say, Switzerland. Switzerland is the most industrialized country in the world. All right? Has a higher industrial quotient, twice the United States. The most industrialized country in the world. Now, people think, when they think of Switzerland, they think of pleasant bankers and, you know, blue suits and so on. And they say, but this is just a banking country. Actually, no. They were the best engineers 300 years ago. Best engineers. They made the best locks. When the French king drove the Huguenots out of France, and they came to England with they came to Switzerland with their money, the Swiss had the best safes, locks, and the best way of keeping and protecting those resources through engineering, not financial services. It was engineering. All right. The Swiss, as you know, maintain a set of tunnels in their Alps for their protection. If you become a Swiss citizen, you do realize that you have to serve in the military, and then you have to serve for 2 weeks every year until you're about 65, I believe. Absolutely. Every citizen has a gun, has a rifle. This is part of their thing. All right? So this is a country, but how did this country manage to gain this foothold as probably one of the most successful countries in the world, in the West so far? Protectionism.
Sovereignty.
Protectionism.
My God.
All right? And they're protected in two ways.
My God.
Switzerland is shaped like a horseshoe. The Alps are shaped like a horseshoe. So it's like in the 300, you know, there's the Battle of Thermopylae. It's just you can't get into Switzerland. So a small army on the inside could keep, you know, a big force out on the outside. So Switzerland's protected in that way. But they constructed their rules to protect themselves and allow themselves to grow in Europe. And that is why they chose neutrality. Because that was in their strategic best interest. They didn't say, everybody is joining, everybody is participating. So no, they said, no, we're Swiss. And we have analyzed the situation very, very carefully. And in order that Switzerland, and the word Swiss, you know that famous line in the murder trials with Cicero, when Cicero says, and he told you he was a Roman, and this did not stay your hand.
My God.
Was he not a Roman? Did you not hear this? Which means that to say, I am a Roman, everything's supposed to stop. I am Swiss. That has a meaning in the world.
Peace.
I am Bahamian. What meaning has this in the world? What meaning has this in the Bahamas? That is the question. One of the things so these benefits of the WTO. And here's what I'm saying. There's a little kernel here. There's a notion somehow that when one says, it talks about the WTO, that one is really saying that it's a useless, horrible organization that has no significant value whatsoever. No, that's not what it's saying. It has a value, but that value may not be our value. It has a value, right? But that value, just like free movement of labor under the CSME, has a value, but it may not be our value. Why?
That's right.
Because the Bahamas has more Caribbean nationals than any other Caribbean nation working in the Bahamas.
Yes.
Already, without the free movement. So we obviously don't need that to be integrated with our Caribbean brethren. So as a strategic proposition, we say no. We say no. If you look at what has happened here, so in 1986, we come down to 1986 now, and we're at the Uruguay round, which is one of the most important rounds of trade at any point. It probably is still the most important round. And here's why it's important. Before, in the GATS, as I told you, the issue was we trade, we make something here, we ship it over there. We want all the barriers to that thing entering removed. Now, I have to set this up a little bit. There was something called the Tokyo round before the Uruguay round. And in the Tokyo round, there were three hatches that were allowed. One hatch was the existing GATS proposition of special and differential treatment. So you had the Quad, right? So that's the United States, Japan, Canada, and the European Union. And then you had all the rest. And they could have that special differential stuff and so on. That's for them. So they were exonerated from, or excluded if they wanted to, from some of the rules which were made. Okay. And the second, but after the Second World War, and certainly by the 1970s, you had a large enough, I think over 123 members at this point, you had a large enough group of members that it started to become a little sticky. You know, you couldn't just go with this special and differential treatment anymore. So they invented a new rule, which was called obey but do not object. Obey but do not object. So disobey but do not object. You could disobey the trade rules, but since you are a voting member and you now outnumber us, and the Quad now has no power to dominate in this way, disobey the rules, but do not object and disturb what we have set up for ourselves. So that was another one. And then the third mechanism that was used in these trade agreements was something called the codes. And the codes were different. So under special and differential treatment, the small nations went to the larger ones in the Quad and said, we don't like this, and so on. They said, okay, you can go special differential treatment, that's for you. Under disobey but do not object, this is the Quad coming to you and saying, hey, don't interrupt what we are doing. The codes required a codification. So it's no longer backroom deals and chats and so on. Now this has to be something registered. And so what they said is, here's what we're going to do. We are going to create these little codes, these silos of agreements within the overall agreement, where you could exclude yourself from certain portions of any particular set of trade rules. And under these codes, you would gain an exemption. All that changed in the Uruguay round. And the reason is, by then the WTO was so large that the larger nations could not see a way to dominate in the way that they wanted to. And that is just a plain fact. They couldn't see a way to dominate. And there's another thing that happened. There was the introduction of what are called TRIPS, TRIMS, and GPAs, right? So TRIPS are trade-related intellectual property rules. TRIMS are trade-related investment measures. And these are very, very important. And you have to keep them separate from tariff reduction, because people talk about trade agreements and they talk about tariff reductions, but that has nothing to do with what happens after you get across the border as an investor. And you have to keep that distinction in mind. So basically what you're saying is this: there's a principle in WTO, if you want to call it WTO or GATT compliant law, which is called MFN, Most Favored Nation status. So when you're negotiating, you reduce a trade barrier, all right, you're saying that, well, the way it was imagined at first is you have a nation that you trade with, that you need to trade with, you lay out a trade agreement with them, but now you have to apply that to every other member in the organization. So that was important. But now on the investment side, all right, on the investment side, on the TRIMS and TRIPS, you now have to have what is called national treatment. And GPAs are government procurement agreements. So now they have everything. So think about it like this. You walk across, you come to the border, you need tariff reduction. You get your tariff reduction, you get MFN at the border, most favored nation status. You get inside now, you say, I'm not just sending you stuff now. Now I'm going to come and put a factory where you are because I see it's advantageous to me. So now you need TRIPS, TRIMS, all right? And then you say, I'm going to open an investment arm, all right, because I see that this country is fertile and I want the opportunity to engage in bidding on government procurement contracts. And then the game is over. The game is over. There's no way, all right, that about 80% of the world's countries can compete with the other 20% in a perfect Pareto arrangement, right? Pareto law, Pareto principle arrangement. There's no way that they can compete. And so it's very important to understand trade, the border issue has to do with MFN, tariff reduction. That's the border issue. The investment issue has to do with TRIPS and TRIMS and GPAs. And if you keep that in mind, you don't allow them to collapse into each other, because essentially there is no rationale anymore, strategic rationale, in keeping tariffs high. There's none. So the only reason you're joining is to reduce tariffs. You don't have to join for that. Everybody is doing that on their own now, because the rationale now is that, you don't have that. And as I said, the Bahamas, as a share of its GDP, is ahead of every Caribbean WTO member, right? It's 26 in the world, so really ahead of almost all of them. And so this is a very, very important, proposition. So basically, under the Uruguay round, you have this change away from special differential treatment, away from codes, away from disobey and but do not object, to a broader area of trade. The problem is that the large countries began to worry about things like agriculture, pharmaceuticals, and financial services, all right? And this caused a great deal of conflict within the Uruguay round. But something happened. And what happened is that the trade ministerial and the negotiators said to themselves, okay, we're going to create something called the single undertaking. And this single undertaking eliminated codes, no one could escape the agreement. So the Uruguay round is the most perfect conclusion in the sense of any trade agreement in the history of the world, because it argued and it concluded with everyone having to agree with every aspect. All must agree or there's nothing. All must agree with everything or there's nothing. All right? All must agree with everything. And this is very, very important to understand. So let's take your TRIPS, which deals with intellectual property. How many of you have noticed that, let's take something like that has a patent, like a drug, let's say. It's funny how you're something that is essentially protected, seeking protection in another place. This is a form of protectionism, where the pharma company is saying, I want this protected. It isn't, and here's the thing, you're not allowed merely not to engage in anti-trade activity against that thing. No. You're not allowed just to frame. You actually have to enact a law, be proactive to protect those. Now, in some senses, an intellectual argument can be made that intellectual property deserves, and this is a big argument, it's not a settled thing. So if someone's sitting there and saying, well, come on, man, you know, if Bayer makes a nice drug and they have a patent, that's a law. Yeah, in another country, so that's in the United States, that's a law, and they gave them protection. And when they come here, they are saying that you must adopt that protection given to us by the United States, recognizing this as a property in our country. What has that done in the developing world? It has driven the prices for medication sky high.
My God.
This is what it's done. But there's another pernicious effect. Let's suppose that Brother Julian here decides to, we have a natural pharmacopoeia in the Bahamas. I don't know if you know that. Now, we don't refer to it in those terms, right? And my mother would say, come on now, you know. So I would say, when your grandmother tells you, boy, drink these bitters, right? That bit of Sarah C. or Bajerina or Shepherd's Needle, or in very exotic cases, Gully Wash or something like that. You all are too young to know about that. And when they give you these things are drawn from our natural pharmacopoeia, right? The environment, the bushes, the reeds, things like this, lemongrass, and these sorts of things that are beneficial to us. There's a war going on at the moment where certain large companies come in under these tariff rules, they come in under the TRIPS, they come in under the TRIMS, and so on. And if you are engaged in that and somehow people refuse the medication and turn to the natural pharmacopoeia, they then have the resources to reach your government, right? To reach your government, to reach your civil servants, to produce papers, to bring big universities with beautiful sounding papers and experts and everything like that. And eventually, as has been done in places like India, they buy out your natural pharmacopoeia and then force, and they have the time. So this takes them 10 years. It's nothing because they get complete capture of your market. And the question is, what are we doing being part of any organization that has that much dominant power over us that we lose the capacity to decide how we even treat our own illnesses? That is the problem. So again, one doesn't say WTO is bad, it's a boogeyman, it's out to get us. One says, have you considered this issue? What is your answer?
My God.
Since you promote it, since you argue for it, no one's begrudging you that, no one's saying that that makes you a bad person in any way. What we're asking is, what is your rationale? Right? You being a son of the soil, me being a son of the soil, laying out the case to you, what is your rationale? What is your rationale? Another issue, or let me finish this point on the Uruguay round. So, the Uruguay round finishes with this single undertaking. Everyone has to agree that It's the most perfect trade agreement ever done in human history. Everyone had to agree it's done, and it included lots of other areas that had nothing to do before identified as trade. I forgot services is one of the things that was included here as well. In 2001, we then rolled over to the Doha Round. And the Doha Round has been an abject disaster. Abject disaster. There are some issues. The same people who have been promoting these kinds of things, who remembers Gordon Brown, the erstwhile Prime Minister of Britain, saying, we have decided to produce light touch regulation in the City of London for financial services. We don't want to look too deeply into the books. The first page, the second page, but after that, we will let them run. So this is the Alan Greenspan presumption, right? This then helps to precipitate not only a financial crisis, but an economic crisis. See, an economic crisis is for us, poor people. Poor people suffer in an economic crisis. A financial crisis, rich people have to start saying, wait, there's no bottom to the value, how do I value my assets? I have no way to value my assets. This is a serious crisis. I thought I was worth thus and so, and now I'm not. So this is a real problem. And Gordon Brown's complicity with American bankers produced this. And so we have a situation now where after the 2008 financial crisis, I read a study last night that was done by the Commonwealth, actually, the Commonwealth. And one of the things that the data shows is that none of the Caribbean countries have returned to their pre-crisis growth rates. And not only that, the growth rates for the world that the IMF issued in 2010, 2011, 2012, 2013, all missed their targets. And you saw that just recently they revised their targets for global growth again. So the argument is, if we could just complete the Doha Round, we would get around this. But here's the big problem with the Doha Round. So terrified by the Uruguay round that from 2001 to today, countries have agreed between them 3,000 regional and bilateral agreements that are not necessarily non-WTO compliant, but outside the mechanism of the WTO. Outside the mechanism of the WTO. Now this is, for me at least, it's quite fascinating that the founders of this august organization find it necessary to create trade deals outside on their own terms, for their own benefits determined by them. And here's the thing. When you make your offer to the WTO, you have parts of your offer is what is called bound or unbound. So bound is the rate at which you will agree to enter the WTO, and that is fixed. You can't change that, right? So if you come in at 15% and everyone accepts you at 15, that's your, and it's your bound rate. You're at that bound rate. You can't alter that. In each case, on average, in these 3,000 regional and bilateral agreements, the effective rate of the tariff is lower than the bound rates that they committed to under the WTO. I wonder if you see what I'm saying.
Yeah, you come out.
Here you have the WTO. This is the trade organization of the world. This is an important, august organization, and so on. When you enter this organization, you're part of this organization, you make your offer to reduce your tariffs to a certain degree. The Uruguay round comes around and the large nations become nervous, and small nations begin to demand developmental focus of the round. And then you have the single undertaking where they say to the Quad, that's the United States, Europe, Canada, Japan, you will have no access to undermine through dispute resolution any aspect of what we agree here. Okay, so now we have no power. To the small nations, you will not escape. No more codes or disobey or don't object or anything. Now everyone has to be on the same page, as the young lady said. All right. And so you have that. And you have this bound rate where everybody agrees. This is important to the legitimacy of the organization, that everyone has these rates at which they've agreed to enter. And then that's the architecture of global trade. You know, when you're sitting down in your office and you're thinking, I want to invest in this country, and you're checking, you're looking at those rates, and you're saying, and then all of a sudden, there's a bilateral or regional agreement where you can get a better rate, and it's done unilaterally. And it's constitutional, meaning that they don't wait to say, we will depend on the dispute resolution mechanism of the WTO. These are what are called deep agreements. So it's more like my investment for your reform. You see my point?
My God.
I'm going to come to you and negotiate.
Then you regulate.
To invest in your country. And then you will negotiate with me certain reforms in your country, codify it in law, and now we are. That's a much more august and robust relationship. And so the door round suffers from this new fractured hegemony. Fractured hegemony. Now, keep in mind what I said to you at the beginning. We're going to come around to where we are right now. So we're working our way there. So this creates a very serious problem in that you have these now independent, unilateral reductions of tariffs and these independent negotiations of investor relationships with government. Now there's a problem. There's a big problem. And that problem's name is China. Because China has used this mechanism as the foundation for its Belt and Road strategy, particularly in Africa. All right. So you've read the stories of African countries having to give up infrastructural assets and that sort of thing because they pledged them in these deeply negotiated agreements and so on, that they can't really get out of it. There's no dispute. Notice none of them have any kind of dispute mechanism, proposition, because, and those persons who are adherents of the WTO will say, you see, that's why the WTO is necessary. But these deals are happening because the WTO was impotent. Do you see what I'm saying? They're happening because the WTO was impotent, because the large countries said, okay, we are not going to submit ourselves to the authority and dominion of larger numbers of, our impecunious brothers. That's not going to happen, right? So we are going to find ourselves and we are going to operate for ourselves in a different way. And this, in fact, they did. The other thing that undermined, and I'll come back to China in a minute, but the other thing that undermined the door around is what is called the global value chain. And I can give you an example of it. So, you remember when President Bush put tariffs on steel, tires, and pantyhose? I don't know why that combination, but it is not for me to enter into the hearts of men and understand what their predilections are. But it was that combination of things. And he had to pull, he didn't pull the steel back because that was for Wilbur Ross, but he pulled some of the tariffs back. And the reason for that was it started to cost jobs in the United States. because significant numbers of the companies that were doing this manufacturing, so for instance, if you take North Carolina. North Carolina was the hub of wood furniture in the United States. Wood furniture. Outsourcing, body shopping, all of that, the entire industry left North Carolina for China. But significant numbers of those who left were North Carolinians and other Americans investing through China using their depressed or their cheap labor markets to re-export to the United States. So you have this unbundling, right? Headquarters in North Carolina, operations in China, operating in different currencies, re-exporting to yourself and so on. I'll give you another example. You know the Fort Worth airport in Texas, Fort Worth. Texas. Looks like an airport. You go there, it's nice, you have a little latte at the cafe there and so on. That's actually one of the most significant nodes in global trade. All of the technology in your motor cars, your mobile phones, your cameras, enters the United States right through there. The largest inland port, so Rossborough owned that land, swapped it with the county, all right? And his son and the county made a deal, and that deal was with the Mexican government, and there's a road that runs from Fort Worth Airport right into the center of Mexico, where all in what is essentially what do you call that, a manufacturing, like not a farm, but when you have lots of warehouses and all that sort of thing. Yeah, absolutely, yes. Yeah. So you have this situation. Now, here's what happens, and this is where Mr. Trump found himself, that having to get a BJC, and the reason is because he thought, we could just put tariffs on automobile parts coming out of Mexico. And this unbundling, this global value chain was introduced to him. Because auto parts may be originally, particularly the technology, designed in the United States, manufactured in China, shipped to Mexico for certain upgrades, shipped to the United States for certain, shipped back to Mexico, shipped back to the United States, and that's how it functions. So this global value chain, it's very hard to decide, what's happening there for all sorts of reasons. And it becomes impossible to agree, because you can't say, well, we are going to give the same opportunity to Vanuatu, because that can't work for Vanuatu. Right? This works for Mexico, which has proximity to the United States. And it can't be done through Canada, because you need low-cost Mexican labor with high skills to make this work. Do you see? So again, the map is dictating what really happens in trade, how value is truly added in trade. The map is dictating that, the map. And so this global value chain now makes it difficult, adds to the difficulties which I've listed. So you have regionalism, you have the global value chain, you have the impact of the Uruguay around, you have the addition of all these other trade iterations, which makes it difficult to come to an agreement. There's one last thing. The door round is a 20th century trade deal trying to dictate in the 21st century. Everything that it's trying to nail down is an analog 20th century proposition. It is out of date. It is out of date. Trade isn't going to happen in the way that people think anymore. You're going to have blockchain and distributed ledgers with your ships on them, with GPS locators, and you'll know where your ships are, and you'll know everything that's on that ship, and you'll be able to actually have credits in your tax columns already before the goods have arrived near your shore. You'll be able to take that and run finance on that by discounting your cash flow and borrowing money today to do things to build your country tomorrow. Completely new sort of trade. And nothing that's happening in the door round can address that.
My God.
Nothing that's happening in the door round can address that. So look at where we are now. We are in a position. We are in a position where the revealed preference of countries in the world is for bilateral or regional agreements in their interests. We are in a situation where the attempt to dominate has proven redundant. So Lord Mendelsohn, under the EPA, threatened Guyana. Guyana said, look, this agreement is not fair, right? You're banning our entertainers from Europe, explicitly telling us to our face that you don't want them competing there because you think it will undermine your culture. A strange business that is, right? And Jagdeo, who was then president of Guyana, begged the Caribbean to, hey, take a stand. Look at this. Do not allow yourselves to be bamboozled, by this. This is supposed to be a legal agreement. Stand up, fight. Let us make sure that we can assert ourselves. The Caribbean chose not to. They were dictated to by the European Union in the person of Lord Mendelsohn, and the agreement went ahead, disregarding Guyana's objection, even though it said that if there is objections, that they should be regarded, promising that after the agreement is signed, we'll revisit it again, a revisitation that never occurred. The other problem for the door round is whenever you have consensus, whenever you try to get consensus between unequals, you have a greater problem, because you have to succeed by doing well for some without doing harm to others. And there's just no way to do that under such an arrangement. And then you end up with utilitarianism, where you try to do the greatest good to the greatest number, all right? But that doesn't work, because a strategic country like Djibouti, which people don't know about, right, in general, but Djibouti is one of the most important trade nodes in the world, because it has access to both the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea. And you can't get around Djibouti, and that is why almost every G20 country has an installation in Djibouti. And Djibouti's political leaders handle that like ringmasters. No one is more dominant than the other. China has its place, the United States has its place, and each one have their places. And Djibouti is able to dominate that. Not only that, Djibouti is the amanuensis for Ethiopian trade, because Ethiopia is landlocked and has to come through Djibouti, but Ethiopia is one of the fastest rising countries in Africa at the moment. And so these are the issues. Now we come to the Bahamas. And there are a couple of observations very quickly, and then I'll come to my conclusion, and then we can have a brief chat. We said that the number one question to be asked has nothing to do with the or strategy for an initiative that will transform the Bahamas and deliver prosperity to its citizens, provide them with citizen equity that we cannot do unless we join the WTO. You see what that is? That means you have to have something over here before you start talking to us about WTO. There's got to be, what's the vision, what's the strategy, what's the initiative that we're talking about? We said that. All right, we said that. I saw on on the Chamber's website, it's very interesting. The Chamber is doing good work. I see lots of good work that it does. But it was curious, at least to me, that it said the consultants, something like the consultants' documents, so the questionnaires, the consultants' questionnaire, on trade and so on. It's very interesting. But what was fascinating for me is the preamble, which said something like, the Bahamas is the only country in the Western Hemisphere that is not a member of WTO. It should have said, the Bahamas is the only high-income country in the Western Hemisphere with the highest percentage of GDP as FDI in its GDP compared to all WTO members. And therefore the Bahamas must have something about itself that makes it unique and able to survive and prosper above and beyond the other WTO members in the group. There must be something.
Gotta be.
There must be something. Now, I could see the Bahamas through rose-colored glasses. After all, I went to elementary school at the parish hall where Bishop Eldon was the headmaster, and my school was on the beach. So I might have a different view of the world. Do you understand what I'm saying? I may have been overwhelmed by the beauty that I saw every day. My excited teachers, Miss Kelly, Miss Morani, Mr. Robinson, all these people, Adolph Springer, Mr. Gilbert, I can just go on, Craven Forbes and the rest, who told us that we were champions. Yes. They told us we were champions. Milo Butler came to Martinstown Primary and put his hand on my head and said, young prince. And so these are things which the Bahamas that I think about isn't described well in that preamble, I'm afraid.
My God.
Isn't described well. Why is that? The Bahamas is an outlier. It's an outlier. We've never taken advantage of our outlier status. So what is an outlier? An outlier is an entity that has a value like all other of its, if you like, corollaries or objects or other entities like itself. So the Bahamas, like all the Caribbean countries and so on. Except in one respect, and in one value that supersedes all the similar values that it has in common with the other entities.
My God.
The Bahamas has a location that cannot be replicated. It is.
Hold on.
It is. It is.
Come on, man.
It has a location that cannot be replicated.
My God.
The Bahamas is also an archipelago. And therefore it's a beta country, meaning that the world is moving towards this fragmentation that we talked about and so on. The world is moving towards digitization. It's already here in many respects. And the Bahamas is a perfect beta location for all of the most cutting-edge technologies in the world. Wow. We've never explored that. So the Bahamas is in proximity, and there, these sorts of countries. There's several of them in the world. I mentioned Djibouti a moment ago. Yeah. All right. Singapore to China, Mauritius to India, Botswana to South Africa, Barbados to Colombia. And it goes on and on. I could even say Jamaica and Cayman to Cuba. All right? And although that's more in the financial services realm, in my view, the main thing is, if we are going to think about ourselves in any way, we have to start with the idea that we're an outlier. Because we have a location next to a value that we didn't create.
You see that?
We didn't create, well, in some ways we did create the United States, but that's a different story. But we are the gateway, absolutely. But the main thing to note is that we have to ask ourselves the question: what value and what strategy, what initiatives have we developed that reflect our location next to the largest economic juggernaut in human history?
Jesus.
Name me one policy. Have we invested in power companies along the eastern seaboard? Do we own significant shares? At one point, the Grand Bahama Port Authority did.
Yes.
But do we own significant shares in U.S. capital markets? Are we the largest investor in municipal bonds, tax-free municipal bonds in the United States? Have we taken any measure at all that allows us, H.G. Christie was a very interesting fellow. Now, I know lots of people have lots of problems with him and so on, and I'm sure if we discuss them, I should probably agree with you, but in one respect, H.G. Christie is the future, and it's in this. He had a villa called Cascadilla, and apparently he entertained every senator, congressman, governor, player on the eastern seaboard in the United States. And when President Lyndon Johnson tried to shut down financial services in the Bahamas, I was given to understand that H.G. Christie could call up the relevant senators, congressmen, and these sorts of people and shut the president down. How have we fallen back from that? How have we not looked at that and said, hey, there is a strategy in there somewhere? There's a strategy in there somewhere. And we seem not to have done that. So this outlier, I want to read something on this outlier effect, and I will conclude with that, and then we can have our discussion. And this is important because if we're going to have a strategy, it has to begin with this. The most significant drawback of the Bahamas WTO session is after the absence of vision and strategy, is the reinforcement of the FDI for jobs strategy. Now, this is very important because the FDI for jobs strategy is actually a non-starter. In a world that's becoming more digitized, if you're making deals to give your people jobs that are going to be done by machines, then it seems to me that you're out of time, right? You're out of time. There's a second point about FDI. Professor Peter Blair, the Hayden scholar who is now a professor at Harvard University, he did a paper here on the impacts of FDI and was able to show that it was kind of neutral. Taking the period in which he analyzed it, which was before digitization, right? Even then, it produced benefits. Nobody's denying that. It produced benefits, but the trade-offs were important. If you build a hotel, I'm not picking on any particular hotel, but you come to the Bahamas, you build a hotel. Nobody comes to the Bahamas for Bahamians. Let's get that straight.
My God.
Nobody comes to the Bahamas for Bahamians. Nobody
My
comes
God.
and says, I'm coming to exploit, this skilled behavior. What they come for is our proximity to the United States. So you come here, you do a hotel. Who's that hotel for? Not for us. It's to attract people in the United States. Do you then say, okay, I have $1 billion. I'm going to transfer that hard currency to the Bahamas to build my hotel? No, you don't. You deposit your money in the United States. You probably associate with an institution that has RBC has a wealth management office, I believe, in Los Angeles or something like that. So you deposit it with some affiliate banker under some understanding and something like that. Then you come into the Bahamas and you borrow B dollars. You borrow B dollars, you do your mobilization and so on. Once you've got everything in line, do you then bring money in to do the things? No, you're playing golf in North Carolina, and there's a guy there who does all the furnishings.
Never shows up.
And another guy who does something else, and that check goes from one side of North
Never
Carolina
shows up.
to the other side of North Carolina. It never comes to the Bahamas.
Never shows up.
All right. And then once you get the hotel built, you're doing your books, you say, okay, I'm the Minister of Finance of the Bahamas. Now we're going to get the money. And actually, no. That money, when the bookings are paid, goes to New Jersey or Fort Lauderdale to the booking agencies or running credit card facilitation companies and so on. Does not come here. You run a $B overdraft in the Bahamas to take care of all your expenses and that sort of thing, offset that and so on. Right? Well, yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And what that means is your employees,
Ignorant.
so you're bringing money in, you're not offsetting anything with $B hard currency to the reserves. But the consumerism that is generated by the employees draws down on the reserves because they can't, so they're paying school fees, they're paying all this sort of thing, and you get no hit. So it turns out that the real solution to this is to invest in and through Bahamians. Because there you can create conditions where the banking has to be done in the Bahamas. And if you think about things like, I forget, the CTO did this study where they showed the daily spend of tourists. I think it was like $70 or $90 a day compared to other places at $700 a day, and so on and so on and so on. So the question is, what's keeping that money in their pockets? And it must be because the cultural plenitude that Bahamians would introduce into the marketplace is absent. Because the buildings and the hotels that we're building don't look like us. We don't function like that. Now, I was looking at some pictures of I'm from Freeport, Al-Lucaya the other day, and there were these mottled pinks and mottled oranges and all that. And I'm looking at this and said, well, we don't live like that. That's not how we actually. I don't see that on my, any choice by any Bahamian that I move around. This is candy apple colors for somebody else, and giving them a certain depiction of our culture. The real cultural elements that when we get together as families and friends and neighbors and things like that, that doesn't seem to be penetrating into the tourist's experience. I always say, if you listen to Burma Road, there's a 7-day menu in Burma Road. Right? 7-day menu. I've never heard anybody cook that menu. So we don't have anyone cooking that menu as an example of our tied to the song, tied to this. What Harry Belafonte said: sing your music, include your culture in your music. They tap their feet to your music. They have to ask you about your culture. And so we don't have this kind of transitivity, all right, between the arrival of tourists and the plenitude of our culture and so on. So this is a great concern of mine, and my belief is, my assumption is, if there was greater cultural plenitude on the landscape when people come here to visit, that we would get a greater proportion of those dollars. So if you increase that from 70 to 140, whatever you're earning now in tourism, you would have that, but it would be earned by Bahamians and Bahamian enterprises and so on. And those funds would be here in the Bahamas and have a positive effect on the reserves. So the FDI proposition is a reserve-busting, jobs-intensive proposition, neither of which can carry out the promises that they project. So the significant danger of this FDI model, this FDI for jobs model, is its backward-looking lack of imagination. Rather, it is also, and I say it is deleterious of the national reserves. The problem with FDI, particularly on hotel and hospitality industry, is the funds never arrive here for us. So I make this case. The outlier strategy for the Bahamas must be invest in and through Bahamians, which not only fosters growth, but ensures greater cultural emphasis in investment and experience. But if the Bahamas government facilitates local enterprise, a condition could be that the profits are held here in the Bahamas, which has a direct positive effect in all the respects which I have mentioned. This leads to a second outlier strategy, that is to say digital currency, because, so now, instead of saying we want digital currency just because don't know why. I haven't really seen the rationale, because it's the thing that you do. Other people are doing it.
Right.
But if you were investing in and through Bahamians, you would have a reason to have a digital currency, all right? Because there are positive effects that could flow from that. Can't go way into that. That would also establish the reason, a rationale for a national electronic ID. And all of a sudden, the outlier proposition is beginning to build out a 21st century economy in the Bahamas owned by Bahamians. So if as a geostrategic proposition of an outlier, it requires nerves of steel. People ask me all the time, what's the role of the Prime Minister of the Bahamas? And my argument is, they say, oh, well, you know, to work for, you know, for Bahamians and so on. The answer is no. The Prime Minister of the Bahamas is supposed to be a global figure. How does he get to be, or she get to be a global figure? Because you have to manage the interest of two of the world's greatest economic juggernauts on the same soil. And what that means is this. Now, we've given away the golden goose, because we have allowed one of those superpowers to come in and have dominion in the Bahamas in exchange for a rusting stadium and a parking garage at the beach. And so we have lost the opportunity to negotiate that entry, and that was the most priceless element of our strategic arsenal that has been given away, that we could have used to leverage our relationship with the other superpower. Right. And that is how you do things. So that, whoever that national leader is, that person has to be comfortable saying, I can deal with it's not just David and Goliath, it's David and the Goliaths. And I understand their issues well enough and their interests on my soil, as Djibouti does, all right? And I can manage this relationship for the benefit of the Bahamians. And that's the mastery of the new thinking that has to emerge. So someone said to me, well, okay, Cecil Neary, who is a fascinating Bahamian, wrote something the other day where he said, someone wrote a proposal of what the government should do, and he wrote in reply, we already know that's not going to happen. And his point was, almost everything you propose, you already know that is not going to happen. No matter which party is in power. Because we live under the delusion that there's a PLP and an FNM, you know, when in fact they're business partners, they're married to each other, every law firm is 50% PLP, FNM, every accounting firm, you know, right down the line. It's a very interesting proposition. So my point is,
he just exploded.
And I've had these conversations with my dear brother, the Minister Nine, if they came to me and said, listen, plot out a course for the Bahamas from here on out. But it has to include the WTO. We're not accepting your proposition. It's already done. We said that we're just looking at these things and basically creating a heuristic, you know, that's what we call it. Create a heuristic, which is a model of what you may do, and then if it's valid and legitimate and substantial, then you go ahead and do it. Which means you'd have done all the legislation, but you would have held them a day until you determine what the people of the country have to say about this proposition. You didn't do that. So if you go down the offer letter or the legislative agenda on the WTO website for the Bahamas, you will see the enterprise bill right there is one of the conditions, which was denied over and over again that was done in any interest for
WTO.
The WTO. So that's interesting enough, and you know, these mistakes can happen, but if they were to say to me, so you're a strategist, and you know, you like to talk about, and I talk about, and fairness, to pick this up about political economy. Political economy, which is very, very different from almost everything else that economists spend their time doing these days. There are very few political economists left in the world. But when you are in a developing country, political economy should be what you talk about, all right? Because you're talking about how people behave in circumstances of scarcity for their benefit and prosperity, and what decisions and strategies have to be enacted to ensure the same. So they said to me, give us your elevator speech on where the Bahamas should go and what we should do and so on, but it will include WTO. You're not getting away from that. All right. I would say, all right, if we had one government that was in power for a very, very long time, right, almost 3 decades, and the other party accused that party of being corrupt. In fact, that's usually the manifesto lead by one party to the other. So if that party really, and the substance of this corruption is you've denied the Bahamian people what is rightfully theirs, you've colluded to keep them out of opportunities, you've kept them uneducated and unable to fend for themselves, and you've reduced them to having to beg ministers of government for just an ordinary job. Okay, so if that's your thesis, right, why would you, when you come to power, invite them into an FDI-led jobs, reserve busting association? Wouldn't you want to restore to them the opportunities, the dominion over the resources of the country, and so on? Wouldn't that be your number one interest? So that would be my interest. So the first thing I would do, I would say, okay, you can have your WTO, but I need 3 to 5 years. And while borrowing costs are low, I want to borrow in the neighborhood of $300 to $500 million. So none of this $5 million stuff. And this is for entrepreneurship development in the Bahamas. This is for Bahamians, and particularly entering the hospitality business. What does that mean? So people often talk about diversifying the economy. Every government that is trying to diversify the economy has failed, unless you are like Qatar, where that guy can say a cockroach is a lizard, and everybody has to say it's a lizard. So it's a dictatorship. It's a beautiful country, but we don't have that kind of government. So when you diversify in a constitutional democracy, you have to diversify from within the core business, your dominant core sector. That's where you have to diversify.
Tourism.
So if you move from these EP hotels, European planned hotels, which is the type of hotels we have, to boutique hotels owned by Bahamians, the same people who are qualified to work in those EP hotels that we have now are qualified to own the boutique hotels of the future. Now, I said to you, we live next door to a value that we didn't create. One of the biggest problems when you are trying to generate an economic model for prosperity and growth is you ask, well, where's the demand going to come from? In our case, the demand has been created by the demographics of the United States. So we don't have to do it, we don't have to do anything about that. And you could say Venezuela and all these places where governments are decided that they want to get a sort of 1936 profile. And so so imagine that we are sitting here in this location. We know certain things that are going to happen as sure as death. 100 million people are going to retire over the next 35 years in the United States. Those people need some place to live, the richest ones of them. All right, they need medical services. They need entertainment. They need to be around culture. They need a safe, clean environment. The same things you need for Bahamians to feel prosperous in their own country. So I would leave, and my view, that demand that all I have to do is to create the facility. I don't have to create the demand. People already want to come here. As the stuffed hotels today, indicate, people want to come here. In Turks and Caicos, the average hotel rate at the moment is around $850 a night. You can't get a room anywhere in Turks and Caicos, all the way up to $7,700 a night. You can't get a room anywhere. All right. People want to come here. Our job is to figure out how to supply that want in a way that satisfies them and makes it profitable for us. That is a unique situation in economic history that's just going to be, that'll be gone forever after 35 years. All right. But we can use that to shoehorn ourselves into the 21st century and develop some things on this landscape that produce sustainable development for the foreseeable future. So that would be my anchor. Invest in and through Bahamians. Leverage the demand that exists that we didn't create, but that we are blessed to have access to. Because that could lead to a diversification. And in order to handle that demand, if we say 1,000 Americans wanted to come here, move here, the wealthiest Americans. Now, economists like to keep up with strange little numbers, like, it was interesting to me when there were 7 million people worth $7 million, when there were 11 million people worth $11 million, you know what I mean, like that. So and there are enough people now that we could say, if 1,000 people moved here and paid the $1.5 million fee, whatever that fee is, that included permanent residency, and they have to do housing, and land purchase and all of that. That'll be 1.5 billion. That's not bad. Tell me something in this proposition of the WTO that could produce that already has the Bahamians who have 30 years of experience in hospitality, the physicians, nurses, dentists, and people like that who are underemployed, and with dozens or hundreds more coming. Tell me where you're going to put them, right? Where's that opportunity? Tell me what else you've got in the WTO that can leverage the medical services in the Bahamas and subsidize medical care for Bahamians. Tell me, is there something you have that achieves that? Is anything I'm saying here outrageous and requires sort of, I think this is all this is as easy as opening a hotel, right? And all you're really saying is, these guests will remain here for an extended period of time, and oh, by the way, while they're here, we have to take care of them. But that expands construction, and it does something else. In order to do this, you have to make the Bahamas pleasant for Bahamians. Because if it's not pleasant for Bahamians, it won't be pleasant for them.
Ain't nobody coming.
So tell me what we have in the WTO argument that meets this criteria, that can achieve this end. Now, there are those who say, well, we could do that as a member of the WTO. Why would you do that and carry out those costs and everything like that when this is available to you? When they're coming to your country, buying land in your country, and Peter Blair has another wonderful paper that's been making the rounds all over on occupational licenses, and that is, our people, we have credentialitis. We like credentials, right? And so one of the things that we can do to feed that, I always say that when what's the princess's name? Kate? Yeah. Yes, when she got married, everywhere else in the Caribbean, people looked at that and said, that's a nice dress. In the Bahamas and Turks and Caicos, they said, I'm going to get one of those. The spirit is different. I'm not criticizing them for consumerism. I'm saying there's an instinct to upward mobility, to success, to believing that you can have things that you see in the world. That's really not prevalent in other places in the Caribbean. This is exactly true. So the question is, can you leverage that for something? And that's what you do. These things, these inclinations, they are leverage points that you can use to transform a culture. That's what leaders use them for. All right. And so it's very significant to me that when you think about what I'm proposing, there is nothing in any other initiative that I can think of Nothing. And I haven't come to the financial services portion of it yet, because you have end-of-life issues and so on. You have for insurance, and Paul Moss can speak to those kinds of things. All right, you have estate planning that has to be involved, because those people who are retiring, they are the baby boomers. They have children. So there's a wealth transfer coming from their parents to them, from them to their children. And that could be facilitated here. So again, when you think of the varieties of areas where we can keep this outlier effect we have here in the region, we don't require any kind of trade deal to make that work. And if you needed one, since in the world, all over the world, they're doing bilaterals and regionals, nothing prevents us from going to the United States and making this proposition. Now, people have said to me, yes, but when you go to these meetings, you know, the United States tells you, well, deal with the WTO. That's because you went to the wrong person. Power is diffused in the United States. You don't just get to wake up one morning and say, okay, I'm going to go ask the United States for a bilateral. No, man. You have to pattern this thing. You have to create pretexts, you know? You have to create leverage points. You have to figure out which research centers and which congressmen and which mayors and which to get them on your side and influence them to the point where they're suggesting to you that you should do a bilateral with you, because we want more of this kind of benefit that you're generating.
Right.
Do you see? And that's how you use a country's resources to generate the pretext to be able to get what you want. And if we were to approach this vision, it means we wouldn't sell or allow to be sold places like Lighthouse Point. It means we wouldn't be doing these big monster developments in Long Island, as one I saw proposed the other day. It means we'd come to the conclusion that the big hotel thing, that's finished. That's finished. If you take the money we spent, the Bahamas spent on, say, something like Bahamas, you say to me, well, we didn't spend any money on Bahamas. Yes, you did.
Of course. That's
Well,
right.
yes, you did.
And the line.
Concessions,
That's right.
concessions, discounted sale of land,
Oh boy.
8,000 persons who were given
Million.
exemptions to be here at work.
There you
The Prime Minister of the Bahamas going and making a deal in China for a private business person. All right? All these costs, these
My
are
God.
benefits, these are, you know, well, what do we get for that?
Nothing.
Nothing. You have to use the leverage that we have, and you cannot sit here and say the Bahamas are small, that the U.S. isn't going to talk to us. You have to make them talk to you. You have to, what does it say? Like with cunning craftiness? I always love that. And when it says, you know, that it's by the sweat of your brow you have to, I didn't actually think that meant like outside in the sun with a big hammer, you know. I thought it meant more metaphorically. You have to work and think and strategize and get yourself in there. And we should know America is too important to us to leave to the Americans alone.
My God.
So we should know it and understand it and understand its leverage propositions and how it benefits us better than the Americans do. And we should, like H.G. Christie, know how to maneuver. I won't say manipulate, but I mean manipulate. And manipulate them to the point where we get them to do what we want.
Right.
I'll end with this story. I have two sons. The youngest one, Aristotle, is my height. And he's a great basketball player. He's 15. And he's very, very talented. And the other one is 6'4", and he's 16. And he has the biggest feet I've ever seen on a human being. I'm sorry, Gilbert, but you know I had to say that. So he's going to get on me for that. But here's the thing. I played basketball with them when they were very, very tiny. I would beat them 100 to nothing. And their mother would come and say, you know, why are you beating them? And I say, stay out of this. This is my business.
It'll come a time.
I need to be ahead 1,500 to 0, because when they start beating me, I have no chance. It's all over for me. And so I will try to prolong that time when they can beat me as long as I can. Now, I will admit that the last time we were on the basketball court, The child did something and then ended up 10 feet away, and I was saying, well, you go right ahead. I don't think I could get there. All right, my age has taught me that I need to stay right where I am. But I took them to Atlantis about 2 years ago, and they said, let's go play basketball. It was 8 o'clock, and I said, let's wait. And I waited until about 11:40. I said, let's go. Sun is high in the sky, and they learned to play in air-conditioned gyms in the United States. I play outside all the time. And so 5 minutes into the game, I was winning, and 10 minutes, I was having to give them water lying on the grass with their professional athlete uncle, who was also out. I won. That's how you fight giants. Understand? That's how you fight giants. Countries like the Bahamas have to have this, our constitution and the map. That tells us where we need to go. Now, how do we get there? We have to have a strategy to fight giants. We have to have an attitude to fight giants. And I will end with this. We are in the habit of rejoicing when we denounce one government or the other in the Bahamas. As all of you know who know me, I have no political affiliations.
Charlie Christie.
But here's the important thing.
You ain't got no horse in the race.
They are not going to change this country. It is our self-indulgence, our settling for nothing, our